This is Living the Good Life Podcast, episode 2002. I'm Kimberly Henrie. Today in our Vibrant Living series, we'll be talking about the science and the benefits of mindfulness. You'll hear the history of this approach to life, and we'll leave you with some simple practices that can be transformational if you apply them daily. Let's begin. Today's guest is a mindfulness practitioner and coach with over 17 years of professional experience providing mental health services to children and adults in a wide variety of ways. She's also spent her entire life working with and caring for horses and is passionate about both human and equine wellness and has managed to combine the two into mindfulness practices for her community, both equine and human. I will also add a disclaimer. Our guest today is known as Aunt Brenda to our family and is my dear sister-in-law, Brenda Chamberlain. Brenda, welcome.
Thanks, Kim. I'm really excited and I really appreciate the opportunity.
It's always wonderful when we can relate on a professional level versus standing over the kitchen counter and talking about chicken wings or something like that.
Right.
So let's dive right in.
Okay.
Tell me about mindfulness from your perspective as a mindfulness practitioner. How do you describe that?
So I describe it, first of all, what it is, and also talking about what it is not. Mindfulness has become a really well-known word now in our modern culture, but its origins actually date back 2,600 years to the Buddha, who was actually a man who lived in India. And these origins of mindfulness come from the teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha actually called these teachings a science of the mind. And I want to make that point clear. Oftentimes, mindfulness is perhaps considered a religion, when in fact there is a Buddhist religion. But what I teach is secular mindfulness based on the original teachings of the Buddha that has been preserved in the monasteries of Southeast Asia. And it was originally intended as a way to have a healthy relationship with our experiences, a way to cultivate what the Buddha called healthy mind states. And so it was always intended to be, the teachings of mindfulness intended to be a science of the mind that we can follow to attain greater happiness. There's many different definitions of mindfulness, but they all have the same elements. So my definition is that mindfulness is the practice of recognizing and attending to each present moment with acceptance and compassion. And we do this in order to stay connected to what we refer to as our true and spacious consciousness, which then in turn enables us to show up in the world as our best, wisest selves. And I know that's a mouthful. Mm-hmm. So another way that I like to describe it is a quote from Viktor Frankel. And Viktor Frankel was a Holocaust survivor as well as a psychotherapist, a psychologist. And he has a quote that's quite famous that says, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom." And that, to me, is, in a nutshell, what mindfulness is, being aware of our experience from moment to moment, the stimulus, and before we make that response, we take a pause, and in that space, in that pause, we can choose our response.
So true. So incredibly true, and I think it's so important now. It's always important. Right now, in a moment of maybe global crisis, it feels like a global crisis. There's a lot of reactionary response. If we can learn to take a pause and respond rather than react, how does that change our experience?
So we think in these teachings, there are some really basic, what we call marks of human existence, meaning experiences that run through our human existence. They are just things that happen. And one of them is that life is always changing. As you mentioned, we're in a huge change, a global change worldwide, spanning the time of a couple of months, perhaps several months. But at a micro level, life is also always changing from moment to moment. we think of it as this river of experience that's constantly flowing through our awareness. What happens if we're unaware of this flow, if we think of it as a river, we're either in a pleasant experience that we want to grasp onto and hang on to and keep with us, but the river keeps flowing. And so we're left suffering because we can't hang on to this good experience. And likewise, when that experience is unpleasant, we react against it. We brace against it or we push away from it. And I know you can't see me right now, but I'm actually physically pushing away from even that idea of an unpleasant experience. Mm. And so we end up getting pulled downstream. If something unpleasant happens, we get caught in this current or that current, or maybe we lose our footing and we get washed away. But if we can, with the skills and techniques of mindfulness, learn to observe that flow of experiences, to step out of the currents, to not get caught in the whirlpools, then we can also choose when we want to dip our toe back into the water. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but I would really love for you to paint the picture of why that might be more desirable than the reactionary lifestyle. So I think many of us feel like, well, if I'm angry and I need to act on that. Why would you choose? Because it is a choice, right? Why would you choose to take that step back and be in the moment? How does that create, for lack of a better word, a better life, or as we like to call it, vibrant living? Why would you make that choice?
This goes back to some really fabulous studies of modern neuropsychology, which there's about 5,000 studies in modern neuropsychology and modern neuroscience of mindfulness that actually support these ancient teachings. And so let's go back to then the analogy of anger. And the first thing I want to make clear is we're not trying to get rid of emotions or make them go away. Happy, sad, anger, praise, blame, joy, sorrow. They're all part of the human experience, and they're all important, and they all belong. And so we're not trying to get rid of anger. We want to be able to feel the anger, and then instead of, for example, firing off that email, to your boss perhaps, that may cause more suffering down the line, we want to take that pause. And what we know about the brain is when, I want to simplify it because emotions are more complex, but for the sake of this conversation, what we know is when we have a strong emotion, we have what's commonly known as an amygdala hijack. And that's referring to a neural pathway in the brain that actually bypasses the parts of our brain that are responsible for good judgment, wise decision making, putting long-term goals over short-term gain, things like that. So all of those parts, that part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex that we associate with, for lack of a better term, adulting, actually gets bypassed when we are presented with an emotion like anger or fear. Those really kick in those survival circuits in our brain that flip us over into fight, flight, or freeze. Mm-hmm. And what we know of studies of mindfulness is that mindfulness and practicing mindfulness on a consistent basis actually strengthens the pathways that are responsible for adulting type decisions and decreases the strength of the pathways that lead us into amygdala hijack. So we're not trying to get rid of the anger. We want to feel it and be able to go, oh, anger. What message are you bringing to me, anger? What do I need to pay attention to? This is a good time, I think, to clear up perhaps some misconceptions about some nomenclature. We talk about accepting everything that comes into our awareness, and accepting doesn't mean that we're condoning. It simply means that we're saying, this is the reality that is happening right now. So acceptance just means we recognize the reality and we can be with it to the extent that we can then get familiar with it and then make a wise response. And that wise response is also a part of mindfulness. Many people, perhaps conceptualize mindfulness as a passive endeavor where, we sit in meditation and perhaps we leave the world or we remove ourselves, when in fact it is jumping deeper into the world around us, And there is a second part of mindfulness that my teacher, Jack Kornfield, talks about. And the Pali or Sanskrit word for that is sampanjena. And sampanjena means that there is actually an active response. So mindfulness is about jumping deeper into every experience, becoming familiar with every experience, so that if the experience is pleasant or joyful, we can, knowing that it's going to pass, experience that joy and that pleasantness on a much deeper level that nourishes our spirit, that grows the healthy mind states that we want to live in. And if it's unpleasant, we know how to step back and observe it and thereby come up with a wise response.
It's so comforting to know that we have tools like this available, and they've been around for such a very long time. As you mentioned, from the time of Buddha, I would even say that they've been around prior to that with the practice of yoga. It's a very similar practice, and we'll talk about maybe what the similarities and differences are if we get a chance to. But what I really would love to hear from you is, why do you think there are more people being mindful of mindfulness? It seems to be pervading our society right now.
Yes, it's definitely coming to the forefront. People are paying more attention, and it seems like people are being drawn to it. I guess the best way that I can talk about it is from my own experience and my own reasons for being drawn to it. And as you had stated in my background, inpatient hospital settings, as far as, working in inpatient psychiatric treatment centers, so a medical model of mental health. Mm-hmm. I was really drawn to the practice of mindfulness initially, like I think a lot of people are, as a way to practice or as a way to manage my stress levels that came from working in very stressful environments. Mm-hmm. And so initially I resonated and was drawn towards mindfulness as a way to create comfort for myself, to increase my own resilience, and to manage my stress. And it certainly will do all of those things. What drew me to this specific form of mindfulness, called insight mindfulness, really I think was, one, its emphasis on compassion, both for ourselves and for other people. So it's a very gentle, non-invasive, very compassionate teaching that emphasizes what we as human beings are capable of versus focusing on what is wrong with us. So, it's really a wellness approach instead of an illness approach. And that is very appealing to me and feels very nourishing to me. So I guess the other part of that is it feels proactive versus reactive. It's really emphasizing daily practice, much like, we brush our teeth every day and floss them. Well, mostly for good, for
Speak
good.
for yourself.
Right. We learn from an early age how to brush our teeth to have good dental hygiene. And we learn from an early age, particularly in school, about physical education, physical hygiene. We learn very little in this culture and in our society about mental hygiene and how to proactively be mentally healthy.
I think that's changing. And that's really the reason for the question. I see that the children now in schools are learning mindfulness. I know that I sit down on the sofa every morning, first thing in the morning. My little routine is to go and take care of the pets, grab my cup of coffee, and I leave my phone in another part of the house. And I sit down, drink my coffee, do a little meditating, just practice awareness and being present. And I know so many others that are doing that similar start to their day. It seems to be just really exploding. People are beginning to understand the benefits of that. And I love that they're teaching that in school. As you know, we have a grandson who has now been diagnosed with autism. And that is one of his coping tools, is practicing mindfulness. And
yes.
I think it's amazing.
And, I think that we have a culture that is increasingly becoming more technology-based. And there's some really wonderful things about technology, but it's also changing our human experience. It's just in the last 50 years that a lot of our daily endeavors are primarily indoors, potentially more and more on technology and more fast-paced. Mm-hmm. So I think people are gravitating towards these practices. And, one of the big things is they're simple practices. They can be done in a short amount of time. They don't need any special equipment. It's all about what we have inside of us. It can be fairly short term compared to the rest of our daily activities, but these simple practices are incredibly transformational.
Yeah. I would love for you to share one or two practices with us before we go. But before we do that, I would love to hear maybe a personal story from you as to a time when you had something really incredible happen from being mindful that you might have not experienced if you would have been acting out of a reaction response.
It's hard to pick just one because, for me, there's so many small times throughout the day that if I am being mindful are really, truly joyful. To pick one big thing is difficult. The thing that comes to mind for me is drinking tea. A little background, my mom is an early riser, and when I was a child, she would usually get up early, and in high school, I would get up early with her and drink tea. So it started as sort of a connection and a comfort. But every morning now, and I've done this for many, many years, at first not even realizing it was a moment of mindfulness, that I would get up and drink my tea. But it has become a mindfulness ritual that I do every morning, from putting the water on, waiting for it to steam. Then when I get my cup of tea, practicing what we call mindful eating or drinking. And it's very short. It's maybe the length of 10 breaths to 5 minutes of sitting and first inhaling the aromas of the tea, which smells different every day. It might be the same tea, but there might be tiny little differences that make that experience different. Feeling the steam come up through my face and feeling it come into the nostrils and in with the in-breath, taking that first sip, allowing the flavors to come into my mouth and feeling the warmth as it goes down my throat. And when I do that and I open my eyes to engage into the world, there's just a deeper feeling of connection and that deep sense of joy. That's part of this idea, not just surviving, but also thriving, feeling those little moments of joy. And they're there. We have a brain that has what's called a negativity bias. And that negativity bias kept us alive when our environment was things that wanted to kill us all the time, bears and tigers, oh my. So it's not a bad thing. It is just a thing. But the more that we can practice these little moments of mindfulness throughout the day, we're sort of, taking that negativity bias that perhaps leans our brain one way and just bringing it back to center.
Two things going through my mind as you're speaking about that. The first one was, I bet the type A personalities are just going nuts right now because the thought of moving through your morning routine so slowly is just foreign and crazy. And the other is, a lot of what you said resonates with what Dr. Jay Kumar talks about in his book, The Science of a Happy Brain, almost verbatim, the negative response and the reasons behind that. And I think for me, just to sum that whole diatribe up, is the compassion. So all of these thoughts, none of it is good or bad. It just is. And if we can experience that it is, and then, as you say, make a wise response to that, we can experience some of those joyful moments.
And, I have not read Dr. Kumar's book, but it sounds like a great book, and I'm going to put it on my reading list. And just to expand on that, there is a whole movement now in psychotherapy called positive psychology that is really melding these 2,600-year-old teachings of the science, Buddhist science of the mind with modern neuroscience to really focus on how can we change our brains. I also read Rick Hanson. He has a book called Buddha's Brain, and he talks about, taking mental states and turning them into traits, things that are long-lasting with us. The Buddha actually talked about creating healthy mental states. So there's really fascinating fusion of ancient teachings and modern science now that's emerging as a new approach.
Do people ask you about your reference to Buddha and Buddha kind of being the source of this mindfulness movement? Folks who are of a religious persuasion, is mindfulness for them?
Yes. So there is a Buddhist religion, like all religions, is concerned with what happens after we die. And that's a separate thing. The Buddha himself was not considered a religious figure. He was considered a teacher. The religion came after the Buddha lived and died. And it's largely based on a lot of Hinduism and Indian concepts of religion. But the Buddha himself was not a god. He was not considered a prophet. He was a teacher. So the teachings that I teach and that are the basis of mindfulness are really those secular teachings that he first put out, really about how to live in this life, in this human existence here on earth better, and didn't so much concern themselves with what happens after we die. In fact, the Dalai Lama has been asked, what happens when we die, and his response was, have to wait and see. So there is a Buddhist religion. That's not what we teach. And mindfulness is actually compatible with all religions and all spiritual practices, and can even be used as a way to deepen someone's spiritual practice or connection to their religion.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. Do you still find yourself doing regular mental health therapies with folks? Is this taking the place of that, or do they work synergistically?
The nature of mindfulness is such that it works synergistically with just about everything, including mental health therapies. I know from my own experience, when I have sought mental health counseling for myself, my background in mindfulness made that experience deeper, richer, more effective, and more short-term. So I think that for most people, it can help with that. And I think that, we are seeing things that fourth and fifth wave cognitive behavioral therapies that have a deep grounding in this mindfulness foundation, and a lot of what's known as body-based therapies, particularly for treating trauma, that have a deep grounding in this mindfulness, as well as this positive psychology movement. So it is really permeating the field of psychotherapy and giving rise to some new disciplines, including what's called now Buddhist psychology, which my two teachers, Jack Kornfield and Tara Brach, are both PhD level psychologists as well as Buddhist practitioners, and Jack is actually an ordained Buddhist monk. And so you have these Western psychology practitioners who also have deep training in mindfulness, who are pulling it together into some new offerings that are really a synthesis of the two.
Wonderful. I would love for you to share some tips with us now for those who are stuck at home. I have sensed that people, now it's been a few weeks. Some people have been sheltering in place for a couple of weeks now. Some are just starting to shelter in place. We're getting antsy. How do we manage that with mindfulness practices?
So I'm going to start by echoing what I'm seeing a lot, on social media and Facebook, and it's great stuff, is it really starts with self-compassion. A saying of Buddhism, and the Dalai Lama says that the heart of mindfulness is compassion, and the heart of compassion is self-compassion. And that's really, really important. But I also think it can be a bit vague, and it's sort of one of those things like, self-compassion, but, I've got homeschool, and then the kids need this, and, when am I going to have time for a bubble bath? So I think a few things that I can say overall is to keep it simple, to allow yourself to feel the fear, the restlessness, the irritability, and to know that those are normal things that are happening. Potentially, in this time of transition, people might be feeling a lot more tired, or they might be feeling wired and trying to get everything done. So all of these things are entirely normal given the incredibly unique situation that we are in globally right now. And so keeping it simple might look like, at the end of the day, if you can sit on your bed and take 10 deep breaths, and that's your practice, that counts. Start wherever you are. Do what you can. Pick one thing. Maybe it is going for a walk. Maybe that's not something you're able to do. But keep it simple. One practice that I really, really like is what I call 5 heart breaths. And it's 5 breaths. Inhale for 5 counts through the nose. exhale for 5 counts, and do that 5 times. And when we inhale, we activate the part of our nervous system that is responsible for taking action, getting moving, things like that. When we exhale, we activate the part of our nervous system that's responsible for calming us down. So if we have an even inhale and an even exhale, we're putting those two parts of our nervous system in balance. And while we're doing those 5 heart breaths, simply placing a hand on our hearts or on our belly has actually been shown, just that light touch, to decrease stress hormones in our brain. And that's a very simple technique. Sitting, breathing evenly, inhaling and exhaling with our hand on our heart. And it can be that simple. And that can help to calm us down in the moment if we suddenly become aware that we're restless, we're irritable, we're agitated, we're gripped by fear or anxiety.
Or kids clawing at you.
Or kids clawing at you, right?
Right? All of those things.
You even deep breathe with your kids. The other thing I want to emphasize is mindfulness is a practice. And the more we do it, the more we train our brain to not go to that amygdala hijack.
Mm-hmm.
And so keeping it simple, keeping it short, and perhaps just picking 3 times a day to sit and do 5 deep heart breaths, and that's 5 minutes a day, can really make a difference. And it happens pretty quickly, and it can be very transformational. But it's better to do a little bit every day than to say at the end of the week, I'm going to go meditate for an hour.
Right. Right. This has been enlightening. We could go on for hours, I know, but it's time to wrap things up. I'd love to hear if there's any other information you'd like to share, and also how folks can get in touch with you if they want to learn more or to work with you.
Sure. So I teach mindfulness in a variety of ways. Traditionally, I teach it in an equine assisted learning environment. So we have classes out here at our ranch in Rifle, Colorado, interacting with horses and learning how to be mindful with horses. That has been put on hold. So I am now also offering an online introduction to mindfulness course. And I also offer individual coaching in mindfulness practices, and people can find me at www.bookcliffe.com. The name of my business is Bookcliff Equine Assisted Learning, and I'm also on Facebook, Bookcliff Equine Assisted Learning, LLC.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking some time to have an adult-like conversation with me today.
Yes, it's been a nice, wonderful exchange, and I appreciate being able to talk about it, because I think mindfulness can really be a tool in everybody's tool set. You know, I go back to the analogy, we're teaching people to fish instead of giving them a fish. These are practices that anybody of any age can learn.
Age-old adage, teach them to fish. And those are the things that stand up when we're in these times for all of time, because they have a lot of truth and wisdom behind them. Brenda, thanks so much.
Thanks, Kim.
If you'd like to learn more about Brenda's services, find her online at bookcliffequine.com. A special thanks to Fruition Studio for supporting this podcast. Learn about heart-centered marketing there at fruitionstudio.com. This is Living the Good Life. Thanks for joining us.